Welcome to Big Tent. For those of you who have not attended before, Big Tent was founded by a group of women in 2019 as a moderate political advocacy organization focused on protecting the rights of all Americans, civic engagement, and promoting smart and effective governance. Before we get started, I want to just let you know, coming up, we have a tent talk April 5th at noon Eastern time featuring Me Vecino, the fastest growing voting rights organization in Florida. So we hope we'll see you there. So it's not an overstatement to say that the future of our democracy rests on the outcome of state legislative elections. We've seen the anti-democratic effects of gerrymandering and voter suppression. Now we need to contend with the independent state legislature doctrine, under which there are no limits or oversight over the ways in which a state legislature may regulate a federal election. The doctrine is drawn from the Constitution's grant of authority to regulate federal elections to state legislatures, not to the states. Under the doctrine, some argue that a state legislature can choose presidential electors any way it wants, even after Election Day. Big Tent is thrilled to welcome Daniel Squadron as our spotlight speaker tonight. Daniel Squadron is an expert on the power of state legislatures. He's the co-founder and executive director of Future Now Fund and Future Now, the umbrella organization for the States' Rights Project and the Lawmaker Network, which are a national effort exclusively focused on state legislatures by helping pro-democracy candidates flip legislative chambers, and by providing legislative support to help majorities achieve results. You may recognize him from his days in the New York Senate, where he served from 2008 through 2017 and was a vital reformer. Welcome and many thanks for being here, Daniel.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone at Big Tent. I'm excited to be here. I know that when Wendy said that we were talking about state legislatures, a number of you became less excited to be here. That's only mostly a joke, because I know that state legislatures over the course of most of our political lives, or most people's political lives, are not the thing that has gotten you to join a Zoom on a beautiful day here in the Northeast. But I'm really glad you did, because as we'll see, it really is critically important. And in fact, I think if we're being honest, the fact that state legislatures have really been left to the worst forces in American politics for decades and decades, close to 50 years now, is a big part of why we have the country we do today. Started with that great song from Music Man, while everyone else was watching Washington, D.C., a lot of Music Man figures, a lot less delightful, were taking over states, just like he did River City, and with much iller intent. So thought it was a good opening, and I'm going to share my screen here. Wendy, you jump in if I do things wrong, or if I've shared my children's school list by mistake. Great. So as Wendy said, I am obsessed with state legislatures. That's true. That was the reason I ran. I thought that there was an enormous opportunity to improve state legislatures. Turned out to be true. Also turned out not that many people were interested in that challenge, and more are, and thank goodness, because it couldn't be more timely. So we're going to go through this conversation. I'm going to take you through a little bit about what the stakes are in state legislatures, and then I'm going to really look forward to a conversation with you. First, it's important to really know what Future Now is. It's got a couple of initiatives. The two biggest are the States Project and the Lawmaker Network. The Lawmaker Network, I'm not here on behalf of today. It's interesting. There's a book behind me called State Capture by Alex Hertel-Fernandez, The Definitive History of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. If you want to learn more about the Lawmaker Network, you can visit its publicly available library of model legislation and resources for state lawmakers committed to improving lives. And certainly a conversation I'd love to have in the future. But today I'm here on behalf of the initiative, the States Project. So that's what I'll refer to from here on. The States Project is focused on building governing power for lawmakers who are focused on creating a healthy, sustainable, and prosperous future for all through electoral intervention, and by bringing lots of folks like all of you into the fight, because the truth is it's hard to have a big impact on national elections and the national direction of the country. State legislatures, what we're going to find over the next 45 minutes or so, is the potential to have an impact is greater than you ever could have imagined. Whether you choose to do that is another question that comes back to my opening about state legislatures. But let's first talk about why states matter so much. Well, there's sort of three levels. And, funny thing that happens to me all the time is I have conversations with people about state legislatures, even family members and friends. They say, oh, yes, states matter because of blank, a single thing, a single policy, or gerrymandering, or building the bench. The truth is, it's hard to get our heads around just how much states matter. I'm in the strange position often of saying yes, and in fact, I do that until whoever I was sitting next to at the Thanksgiving table gets up and goes to have a less political conversation. So let's talk a little bit about why states matter so much. A lot of the policies that drive people's engagement in groups like Big Tent, if we're being realistic, the federal government is not going to ride in on a horse and save us. The Supreme Court is certainly not going to exceed expectations and lead to a better outcome than we think. Talking about abortion access or reproductive rights. The Supreme Court, I think, is queued up based on a state law, to be clear, to destroy that right. States across the country today are debating bills to imprison women and doctors who access that sort of healthcare. That's going to happen in states. The right to vote, anti-voter laws, we'll talk about those a lot today. At this point, it's up to states. 200 laws have been introduced or passed in states around the country against voters since the 2020 election. Remember, we beat Donald Trump, those of us who thought he was a threat to the very democratic system, and it didn't solve all the problems. Clean drinking water, this is something that in this country we should be taking for granted. Well, due to the corruption of state governments and regulators, places like Michigan, North Carolina, around the country, people can't take it for granted anymore. That is a massive failure of just us as a civil society happening at the state legislative level. Basic civil rights, one of the proudest votes I took in the New York State Senate was for marriage equality before the Supreme Court validated it around the country. That's a basic right that went through state legislatures long before it went to the Supreme Court. Obviously, healthcare, we'll talk about that, all of this. In fact, talk about healthcare. This is the second reason. You want good national policy, it doesn't come down from on high. It's the best policy, certainly not written by the lobbyists inside the Beltway. Let me tell you, as a state lawmaker or a member of Congress, your special superpower is not coming up with ideas from scratch. These ideas germinate and develop at the state legislative level. Before we had Obamacare, we had Romney Care, not when he ran for president, when he was governor of Massachusetts. He didn't discover it from scratch. Hawaii had a super similar system going back to the late 1970s. The most important national policy starts in the state. By the way, the worst national policy starts in the states. It works both ways. And I still haven't gotten you because you're just a believer that a couple of people are going to save us. By the way, if you are, that's great. I could use that optimism. Well, Stacey Abrams, Barack Obama, my mentor, Chuck Schumer, all started as state lawmakers. So did David Duke and Matt Gaetz. Who is going to lead and define the conversation tomorrow is running for and serving in state legislatures today. And little thing there at the bottom, flashes. If you care about democracy, then you really should care about state legislatures, because over the next 2.5 years, the democracy will live or die in state legislatures. So we're going to try through this conversation and through the work of the States Project to bring this importance together in a way that both is compelling to you and that you can talk to your friends and neighbors and network about, and work together to have an impact on outcomes, because, as I said before, to have an impact in state legislative outcomes is like 1/10 the dollars it is for even a single congressional district. In fact, entire governing power in large state legislatures, Florida, elsewhere, the entire amount of money that has to be spent for those kinds of campaigns is the cost of one expensive congressional district. In smaller states, it's not even close. For the entire effort to control the state legislature. So let's talk about it relative to democracy. You know, this is interesting, and this is, if there's one part that you really tune in for here this hour, it's really this one, because these are a bunch of concepts that I'm sure you're familiar with, but I think they add up to a very different story than the one that maybe you're seeing in the daily newspaper or on cable news or on your social media feed. It's first gerrymandering, folks. Let's see how many are on video, but for those who are, folks have a sense of what gerrymandering is, the drawing of districts politically by politicians. Okay, so everyone knows that it is a big issue for Congress, right? Gerrymandering, big impact on controlling Congress. Okay, you know what the other thing that's happening? A lot of gerrymandering, a lot of the most egregious gerrymandering, in fact, sometimes negotiations between congressional districts and state legislative districts is happening for control of state legislative chambers, for state legislative chambers themselves. There's an enormous effort at great political cost, even sometimes at the cost of congressional gerrymandering dominance in states, especially swing states in America, to gerrymander, so much so that every swing state in America today has unified Republican control of its legislature. Everyone, even though in a number of those states, a majority of people are voting for Democratic state lawmakers. Gerrymandering, not just about Congress. Anti-voter policies. Now, who's heard about these? Probably a lot of people. I would bet actually that you're joining more of these calls because you're really worried and upset about anti-voter policies. Does that land for a few folks here? Well, you know, there's a couple things to remember. One, even if the federal government were to pass the bills that it failed to over the last year, a lot of these state laws are still going to be law. And there's another thing about anti-voter policies that's interesting. First of all, it's important to always say they truly are a moral abomination. They are a stain on our country. Because one thing voting laws do is they define who the people who are passing them believe really should have a say in our country, who's truly an American. And so the impact on our civil society of voting laws is something I never want to look past, who we are as a country. However, the strange thing is they're actually decide elections less often than you would think. A couple of reasons for that. One is sometimes they just have an impact that folks didn't predict. So sometimes, you know, there's a voting law passed by one party, they think they'll get a benefit out of it, actually benefits the other. And the second reason is, you know, they can sometimes really galvanize the folks who are being suppressed, the folks who are being targeted through those anti-voter laws. And being realistic, it's only in the closest of elections that they decide them. Then we have to ask ourselves a question. They're a moral abomination. They're actually overall unpopular. And yet Republican-controlled legislatures around the country are passing them, taking the political hit like wildfire, even though it's only in the rarest of cases that they will decide the outcome of an election. Why is that? Well, let's go to the third thing that I'm sure you've heard a lot about. A lot of articles about this. Steve Bannon can't help but talk about it on his podcast. I'm not a listener, I have to admit, but that's what has been reported. For those of you who are regular listeners, definitely feel free to jump in the chat and correct me. But there's been this big effort to politicize the administration of elections, to have people run for Secretary of State who believe the big lie, the claim, false claim that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, to get volunteers and frontline election workers who believe the same thing. Here's what's strange about this. It's a lot of effort going into that, and these election administrators are really unlikely to be able to sway the outcome on their own. It's not impossible, but it's very hard because they have what's called a ministerial impact or role in these elections. That means they have a role that's really heavily constrained and defined by the law. Now, look, they can create doubt and delay like nobody's business. Think of Brad Raffensperger in 2020. If he had refused to certify, probably the Georgia courts, as conservative as they are, would have required him to. The law is that clear. Certainly federal courts would have. And if he had done what Donald Trump suggested, which is to go find the votes, you can be sure that's a felony, and he would have been caught for it. Believe it from a former state lawmaker, one who didn't commit felonies, but served with a surprising number of people, maybe not surprising number of people who did. When you are committing felonies while the world is watching, you get caught for it. Raffensperger would not have been able to find those votes. So what is the purpose of all of this politicization of election administration? What is the purpose of all of these anti-voter laws when both of them are unlikely to change the outcome? Well, they lay the groundwork for state legislatures to justify intrusions after the election into the presidential race or create a false justification for that. How do they do that? Well, we know that the anti-voter laws mean that everyone's complaining about the election before it occurs. The folks who believe the big lie, increasing number, by the way, month over the last year. The folks who believe the big lie, they're complaining about the election, they believe the big lie. Folks who care about Americans being allowed to vote complain about the election because these anti-voter laws are a moral abomination. So you have both sides heading into election complaining about it. And then you have election administrators who are politicized, who are not able to change the outcome most likely, but are certainly able to sow doubt and delays and chaos. Well, if state legislatures were able to, in that environment, that falsely created environment, they could swoop in and decide an election potentially. And remember, every swing state in America has a unified Republican legislature in which significant numbers of that majority have signaled support for the big lie, in which only tiny, tiny numbers of those majorities have admitted that Joe Biden won the election. Well, there is a formerly fringe, continually unjustified and inaccurate constitutional theory that would allow state legislatures to do exactly that, to swoop in before, during, or after an election and decide how a state's electors go to Washington. It's based on a couple of lines in the Bush v. Gore decision in 2000, written by Chief Justice Rehnquist, who said state legislatures have a plenary or absolute power over federal elections and over electors. He also said in that decision that the risk of all Floridians being disenfranchised because the state didn't meet something called the federal safe harbor deadline, the deadline by which Congress has to count electoral votes, was a greater risk. The risk of disenfranchising all Floridians because the safe harbor deadline was missed was greater than disenfranchising a few people for hanging chads. That is being misinterpreted throughout conservative legal circles to justify the independent state legislature doctrine, the idea that state legislatures, without any judicial or gubernatorial oversight, can decide whatever they want about electors. 4 justices on the Supreme Court have signaled their openness to this theory as recently as 2 Mondays ago. Amy Coney Barrett hasn't weighed in. John Roberts has been in both places. 4 other justices, Gorsuch, Alito, Thomas, and Kavanaugh, have signaled their openness. If 5 justices of the Supreme Court supported the independent state legislature doctrine, and we had an election that everyone was complaining about ahead of time, we have unified majorities in every swing state in America that supports or believes in the big lie, and we have election administrators that purposefully and willfully refuse to do their jobs, you see what the stakes are for the democracy in state legislatures. Good news is it's springtime almost, it's March of 2022. We have time to do something about this and prevent it. There is real opportunity, meaningful opportunity to change the tide in state legislatures. Think of this for what it is, which is a fight between those who believe in democracy and those who prefer autocracy. That is the core battle here. Democracy means even if your favorite candidate doesn't win, you don't gin up a false constitutional theory. You don't use partisans on the state's highest court, and you don't nullify the votes of the people. That's democracy. Autocracy means I get power any way I can. We believe in democracy across parties. Here's the opportunity in 2022, and here's what's possible, and here's why it's possible. Take a deep breath. These are tough times we live in. All is not lost. We have a great opportunity. And the most amazing thing is almost no one other than narrow special interests has even tried to have any kind of influence or power in state legislatures for 45 or 50 years. A small number of people getting involved can have a huge impact. Let's talk about why we have an opportunity in 2022. Who here has heard that 2022 is likely to be a tough year politically? The president's party in midterm elections generally doesn't do that well. A bunch of folks have heard that. Obviously, a number of different dynamics out there, including the president's approval rating that, suggests a tough year. And that's true, and we need to go in eyes wide open. But you know what? 2020, outside of the top of the ticket, and even at the top of the ticket, was a surprisingly tough year. It was a lot closer than people expected. 2021, we worked at the States Project in Virginia very closely, was a really tough year. And one reason for that is a whole lot of progress was made in 2018 and 2019. Those weren't tough years. And so you sort of see these ebbs and flows. It is true that we have a midterm with a Democratic president this year, but we also are coming off of the kinds of tough years that elected that president. And in 2021, you don't always have. So those ebbs and flows could be unpredictable. Also, while in every one of these states there's an electoral opportunity, it's important to say the number of votes we're talking about for governing power in state legislatures is vanishingly small. It's not 45,000 votes in each of 11 states. It's 45,000 votes across 11 states. And in 2020, that included states like Texas, where 11 million people voted. 46,000 people changing their votes in 11 states, and instead of unified control for majorities who believe in the big lie, we would have power for folks who believe in democracy. Literally 46,000 votes across 11 states, states in which more than 30 million people voted. Tiny shifts in the electorate, tiny shifts in people's preferences can have seismic impacts at the state legislative level. And important to say, we are living in unprecedented times, whether it is the fight between autocracy and democracy happening in Ukraine right now, where people's lives are being taken, or it is COVID, or it is inflation, any of the big issues, things are changing and shifting much more quickly than in any of the historic examples we have. So there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of unknowns. Let's talk about where and how. Now, Arizona, Michigan, Nebraska, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania. These are all swing states. Nebraska is not a swing state, but it's a place that sends its presidential electors by congressional district. The second congressional district in Nebraska in 2020 sent its elector to Joe Biden. Each of these states today, you have unified majorities in both chambers. Nebraska, as I'm sure you all knew, is the only unicameral legislature in America. But in each of these states, you have unified majorities in which not everyone, but vastly more folks have spoken out in favor of the big lie, have said that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, than have said the opposite in those majorities. In fact, tiny percentages of folks in those majorities have acknowledged the election outcome. And of those tiny percentages, an enormous percentage are being run out of their party or not running for re-election. But look how close it is. In Arizona, a single seat in either legislative chamber. Tell you, I ran for state senate at 28 years old against a 30-year incumbent, unknown, not particularly experienced in state legislative work, just knocking on 7,500, 7,684 to be exact, doors, change that race. Small decisions like that can have huge impacts. In the Arizona House and Senate, you're talking about one seat in each. Michigan, 3 seats in each chamber. Nebraska, because of its constitutional structure, a single seat. New Hampshire, in the Senate, only a couple of seats. Pennsylvania, a little bit farther. But an interesting thing in Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, whoever wins in 2022 for state legislature won't actually be in office when the presidential safe harbor deadline rolls around in 2024. Because in those states, the newly elected legislatures take office more quickly. So in those states, we have both a chance in 2022 and 2024 to beat back the big liars. So these states, so close. We need them to have a fair presidential election, but they're close. Some other states too. Remember at the beginning, it wasn't just about saving the presidency. Remember how important state legislatures were for incredibly important policy in people's lives, for building a bench, for setting the stage for national movement. These are interesting states. Alaska is the only bipartisan coalition in America. The Republican speaker with a lot of Democratic members in her caucus beating back the most conservative governor in America and some terrible policies. Nevada, we have unified control today. We need to defend that. In a tough year, we've got to defend against this becoming even worse. And if we do, a lot of these places, good things can happen. Good things are already happening in a lot of these places. And then even in a tough year, places like Minnesota or Virginia, where we lost the trifecta in 2021, we could get it back. We could get it back come 2022, assuming Virginia ends up with elections. A lot of opportunities, tiny numbers of votes, tiny numbers of seats, tiny amounts of money. So the States Project cares a lot about state legislatures. You've probably been able to sense that over the last 25 minutes or so. But we also care about it. In fact, the reason I left office, I gave up my state Senate seat, Lower Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn, best district on earth, as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure you all love your districts as much as I do. But I gave up my seat in 2017 to co-found Future Now. Not because I newly believed in state legislatures, I always had, but because regular people who cared about politics were willing to hear the message about state legislatures and do something about it. If 100 people get into a room and spend a year trying to change the direction of a state legislature, they can be successful. They can certainly be one of the most important forces. I had said that probably 10 dozen times prior to 2017. Suddenly in 2017, when I said it and people's hair was on fire about the president and what he was doing to our country, people were willing to give it a try. And what they found is that they were able to get off the sidelines, to no longer be observers to the destruction of their democracy. That when they watched cable news at night or read the newspaper in the morning or obsessed on their social media feed over lunch, they no longer felt powerless because them with a group of people could actually change the balance of power in a state legislature, could actually maximize the chances of electoral success. And a lot of people did it. We've had 149 giving circles, groups of people. By the way, 90% of giving circle leaders are women since 2017. They've gone out and they've found 12,000 people through organizing and engagement and education to become parts of those giving circles, to contribute what they can from $5 to $5,000. Together, they've raised over $10 million. 100% of the dollars they raise, the States Project puts into states, puts out the door into states to build power where it matters in these legislatures. Endorsed nearly 250 candidates, and we've had a big impact, haven't always won governing power, but a big impact in 22 chambers in 15 states. Pretty amazing. 149 giving circles, not that many. Most important individual contributors to state legislative power in America. If you care about the country and you feel like you're tearing your hair out, I'm sure there are other things that matter. Believe me, they're not sending a tweet a day. They're not calling your member of Congress who already agrees with you if they do. So it's not those things, but there are a lot of other things that are meaningful and powerful. Make sure you're considering the impact you're having with the time you spend against, for example, the impact of giving circles. Because this is an opportunity for folks. What I always say to people, and I believe this, is I didn't choose state legislatures for the glamour or for the wealth or for at that Thanksgiving dinner, people having any idea what I do for a living. I chose to spend my life trying to improve state legislatures and build power for lawmakers who care about improving lives, because I can't think of a way that I can have a bigger impact on our future in our country. If you have a way that is higher impact than this, please do email me. It's daniel@statesproject.org, because if I could both do something that people understood a little better and also have an impact, I'm open to it. But if you can't, consider getting involved in the state legislatures. We hope you will. And with that, I will open up the floor to 25 minutes of conversation.
Thank you very much, Daniel. We have a number of questions in the chat, and we have quite a few as well. So talking about the giving circles, what are the most important things people should think about when recruiting some giving circle members? Do you look for diversity or sameness, number of people? Is there a need for a specific goal for donations?
So think of a giving circle as your own giving group, as your own way to define your political effort. So you sign up for a giving circle, you get your own web page, you give yourself a name. A lot of people give themselves logos. There's a way to do that. You actually set your contribution goal. It's up to you. You know, contribution goal, we've had giving circles with 6-figure contribution goals. We've had giving circles with $1,000 contribution goals. And a really important part of it is do it with a friend or a couple of friends. Lead it like a group. That's one of the really satisfying parts of it. Small group that understands how to work together. Do what you would do if you were organizing any effort. You know, sometimes people say, you know, I don't really want to, you know, I don't like money in politics. I want to do organizing and volunteering. And one of the secrets of politics is raising money, convincing people that it's worth opening their wallet at whatever level they're able, $5 or $5,000, is organizing. That is engaging people in a real meaningful way. So I wouldn't say go send an email and say, you know, I'm running the marathon, please contribute. That is a great and valid and admirable way to fundraise for lots of good causes. Because with Giving Circle, you're really trying to bring people farther into the political process. You're trying to help them see both the power of state legislatures and how much impact they can have themselves. Start by introducing folks to the idea. Start by having a gathering, Zoom or in person, in which you just talk about the power of state legislatures. You get someone from our team to come and talk about it. From there, build the community and the group, and build the community you'd like to build, like you were building any other effort. We try to make that as easy as possible. And our goal is for you to know as much as we do about states, sometimes more about your own state, and to be better at making the case to your network than we ever could be.
Do you or future, do you provide support for people who are starting giving circles in terms of logistics of setting it up, in terms of targeting where the money should go?
Absolutely. We have an increasing library of, well, first of all, you get to choose which state you're going to impact. I personally, our Giving Circle team doesn't always agree with me, but I personally think the best thing to do is to not choose your state when you first set it up. Get people excited in general, and then you can do a state selection meeting where different members of your group choose a state that they're going to advocate for, and you do a vote, make it democratic, small d, democratic. And one thing that happens is whoever chooses states that don't win sometimes really cares so much that they wake up the next morning a little frustrated and disappointed. But you know, democracy is a wonderful thing, and we have to respect winning and losing. So at some point you choose a state, either initially or as you go through the process. We have enormous support for it. So the head of Giving Circles is actually the person who started the first one. I said that I had kind of, 10 dozen times made the case that people could have an impact. No one had ever taken me up on it. The first group ever to take me up on it was at a holiday party in my district I was invited to. By the way, have you ever invited your state senator to like your actual holiday party at someone's home? No, but 2016, people were fairly politicized after that election. So first ever holiday party I'd been invited to speak. I assumed it was a Saturday night. I would go, they'd say, thanks for coming, but this was a bad idea. And I would go home, hopefully in time to hang out with my wife before she went to sleep. I got there, to my surprise, they let me speak. I made that same case about state legislatures and the power. 2 authors of young adult novels came up to me after and said, we want to do it. We're in. I said, yeah, I don't believe it. They were so in. They started while I was still in office on their own Giving Circles. One of the 2 young adult authors is now the head of our Giving Circles program. And she's developed material, and I watch a video of her online. And, her journey to really be the chief organizer of this incredible movement really does show how accessible this is to lots of people who never considered it.
Can you talk a little bit about how you do your research to target legislative districts or recruit candidates? And also, if you can address how your operating funds are covered if 100% of the Giving Circle funds go towards your target states. This question from Karen Parker.
Sure. So a lot of reasons not to do state legislative elections, right? I mean, who here thinks, every state legislator, is a pillar of democracy? Not every state legislator is, by the way. And in fact, one of the things we do is we vet really carefully both caucuses. This is an important thing. You know, we get obsessed sometimes with the shiny object, the person who has the amazing launch video that goes viral. But in legislatures, take this from me, and you know, you can see I passed some bills when I was in office. The individual is much less important than the governing coalition, than the majority. So we vet folks both in the governing coalition they're going to be in. The most important vote any state lawmaker ever has comes at the beginning of their session when they vote for leader, who they choose for leader. Because that leader is going to organize the governing coalition 9 times out of 10, 99 out of 100. And so we vet both what governing coalition they're going to be in and the candidates themselves. The second reason, so not to be in state legislatures, is exactly that. It's complicated. 50 different states. You know, there are 50 different campaign finance laws. Anyone who's ever dealt with federal campaign finance law, how much am I allowed to give to that congressional candidate when I go onto their Act Blue page or their other page? 50 different campaign finance laws, over 7,000 state legislative districts in America, 99 chambers, because as we know, Nebraska is together now unicameral. That's right. So we spend an enormous amount of time researching actually campaign finance law in every state. Compliance is enormously important to us. Governing caucuses, what each caucus is going to look like, and the candidates we endorse. We have a team to do exactly that. And in fact, this year we've brought on 3 of the best, what are called caucus directors, 3 of the best people who in the states on behalf of legislative caucuses were doing this back in 2020. We've brought into our team so as to have even more credibility and even more of a dynamic relationship with folks in state who are the ones who get the dollars and spend them. And our job is to help them make good decisions. In terms of where the resources come for those kinds of teams, our board and individual donors, and it's all disclosed, at least from our affiliated PAC, the PAC for America's Future, contribute for all of the dollars we need for overhead, research, legal, et cetera. And so that's why we're able to say to the giving circles that 100% of the dollars you raise will increase our budget in the state you select. So for folks who don't much like a giving circle, who already have enough groups you're part of, enough people calling you, if you want to just be an individual supporter to the state's project and that effort, a bunch of those dollars also go out to the states, and you allow this entire virtuous cycle to exist.
Can you talk a little bit about messaging, how you determine what message to get to voters, and also the sort of sad question from Susan Lehman, does the average state voter really care about democracy?
I'll start with the first question. And they're both good, great questions. So on the first question on messaging, there's a couple of important points. One is, you know, there's a lot of folks out there who, you know, will come on and say, oh, there's a silver bullet message. Everything that's wrong, not just with America, but with the authoritarian rise across the world can be solved with this great TV ad or this message. We don't believe it. We believe that there are large tectonic forces that are shifting and that are driving a lot of the conversation. It doesn't mean that what you say doesn't matter. It does. But let's just be healthily skeptical of any individual, any piece of media that anyone claims is going to change the entire direction of the zeitgeist. It's unlikely to do so. For that reason, we actually work with the candidates and groups of candidates, the caucuses, as much as we can. So unlike a lot of political action committees, 90% of the dollars that we contribute into states goes directly to campaigns and caucuses themselves, which means it doesn't just go to TV ads or direct mailers. In Virginia in 2021 and 2019, we said among the 9 candidates we endorsed, those who knocked on the most doors themselves, got out there and met the most voters by knocking on the doors, would get more contributions from us, larger numbers than those who knocked on fewer doors. That's the kind of thing that we're able to do by working directly with candidates and caucuses, contributing directly to them. Now, in terms of the message and the framework, it's important to say that in a lot of state legislative districts, the challenge is about making sure the candidate themselves is known. That's why knocking on doors matters so much. You can meet a critical mass of people in most state legislative districts in America. You can't in congressional districts. You just can't do it. And showing that you authentically care about the district and the issues affecting the district is key. You know, one reason that the Alaska bipartisan coalition works well? You have a governor who's against ferry service for Southeast Alaska, where you can only reach it by ferry service and air service, and has had some terrible positions around their personal fund dividend, the unique Alaska sort of universal basic income. Those local issues are driving governing power. That's true in a lot of states if you can get the message out with the resources and candidates who are willing to meet voters. Do voters care about democracy? Well, some do. By the way, some care about autocracy. This has been a fight in this country for many, many years, I would say, since our founding. There has been an autocratic vein, and there has been a democratic, Enlightenment, humanist vein. And it is an ongoing, hopefully ever better. I think for many years it appeared to be ever better, and I am confident it can be again, march towards the Enlightenment and humanism. Some people care about democracy. People, a lot of people, and you have to respect this, care about their lives because their lives are hard. They care about democracy, but they care about being able to pay the credit card bill at the end of the month. They care about living in a safe community. They care about the schools their kids go to. They care about their parents' health care and not having a couple of years shaved off their life because we have a terrible system, or because the government is peddling drugs that shorten people's lives and lead to mass addiction. Those are the things people are experiencing and care about primarily. Now, an interesting thing is happening in this moment. It's a little bit like people, gravity is not a political position today. But when Newton first came out, there was an interesting debate. Democracy for a long time was not a salient political issue, partially because who was really against it? I think that as we see what's happening in Ukraine, as we see what Donald Trump is peddling, when we see the takeover of the Republican Party, I do think that for more and more people, the connection between democracy and what's happening in their lives, and having a say, having a country and a government that cares about them, not just about the small number at the top, I think is going to become a more and more salient issue. And I think we need to both remember why it isn't for lots of folks and understand that it is going to increasingly be, and not be afraid to make the fight about that, partially because people are smart and they know what we care about. And so we should be willing to say it.
So switching gears a little bit, one of the questions we have is, how do we decide how and who to support in 2022 between national and state and local races? And do you advocate that we dig down to the school board, to town councils? It seems that in Greenwich, Connecticut, where a lot of our people are from, that makes sense. Or should we focus on state and national races in 2022?
So look, I mean, I think if we were to do a chat, like, what does this fellow care about? I think we'd probably get 100% agreement that I am pretty obsessed with state legislatures. So let's consider the source and the answer. And I appreciate you giving me the chance to answer. But I do want to sort of contextualize why I believe that state legislatures should be the first thing you do, though not the last. The first is, look, more people more involved at any level of government, not because they have a transactional need out of that government, but because they have a set of values that they care about, is better for our country. The more, I mean, again, two veins in this country's history, the best of the founders talked about that, really engaging folks, creating a system where folks wanted to be part of it would be a better system. So wherever, if you can't get excited about state legislature, but you can about school board, you are doing an admirable, an honorable thing. It is important to remember, and this kind of gets to the yes and part of state legislatures. When I, did my first trips to DC, where I don't live, and I've actually never worked despite my time with Leader Schumer. and I talked about state legislatures in 2017, 2018, everyone said, yes, absolutely. They're so important for gerrymandering of Congress. And of course, I was in the strange position saying, yes, they are. And one of the things that I think is important about state legislatures is, for better or worse, and often in our country's history, for worse, there are certain powers, not the powers the independent state legislature doctrine would propose, but there are certain powers that are inherent to state legislatures in our constitutional system. Those powers have been increased, since the Reagan era. And so if you're talking about school boards, they're creations of the state. If you're talking about federal elections, as I've talked about a lot tonight, they may not exist in any kind of meaningful way if you don't care about the state. I am a deep believer that the state really is the crux of the challenge, and really, as I've said a couple of times, has just not gotten enough focus from folks like everyone here, which I don't think is true of the federal government in the same way, if I'm being frank. I think it has gotten a lot of focus, certainly since 2016, by folks like the folks on this call. School board, maybe more and less, but I bet for a lot of you, you were pretty interested in school board, or you are, during the period of time your kids are involved in the schools. And there's a rhythm to it. State legislature, you need to choose, you need to look for, you need to think about. So I would not discourage anyone from being involved at any of those other levels of government. And I would say just be a little careful about the, yes, everything's important, and so I'm not going to target my impact. I guess just the final piece, Wendy, sorry, but that targeting of your impact, there's one, you are not an observer to the destruction of your democracy. As I said before, you are a major part of our civic life. Now, your vote is important because it's who you are and the message you send. Your vote is unlikely to decide the election. Actually, in Virginia in 2019, it literally did decide, in 2017, it literally did decide the majority. So it can, but your vote, your participation in those ways is about being a good civic citizen. This kind of work, the resources you have, the network you have, is about having an impact on the outcome in addition. And don't let yourself off the hook from that impact. You're not only doing this because it's the right thing to do. You're not only doing this as a signal. The evangelical right wing, the new right movement of the late 60s and 70s, didn't take the view that they were losing the traditionalist Christian white country that they had taken for granted and say, that's upsetting. They saw themselves as able to change that tide. It is critical that those who support and believe in democracy and in the kind of civic institutions that are this country at our best have the same view of your own agency.
So this next question, I guess, takes you back to your days in the state Senate when you went to the floor and moved to remove Dean Skelos for after he'd been found. I don't even know what yard.
It was just when he was indicted. I think there was a move by the Republican conference to keep him leader indicted, if I recall.
One of the questions is, legalized corruption is very evident in DC with all the corporate lobbying. And James Reeser says, in my state, Ohio, corruption runs rampant in the open. How do we counteract this? This may be beyond the scope of your talk, but this does seem to be an area of
I mean, thank you for, this was an issue I spent a lot of time talking about in the legislature. I'm very pleased to go back to it. To everyone other than James, I apologize. James asked, though. I didn't, he's not a ringer here. There's a couple of things that there are a couple of really important things about political corruption to keep in mind. Politicians, I like to say, are almost like people. And in fact, politicians are kind of like people who in some part of their soul want to do good work. People are not going to the state legislature and getting massive ego boosts every day. And in fact, even the kind of corruption that you see generally, people are rarely enriching themselves through the state legislature or their work in it. Corruption is rampant, but think about that corruption for a moment from the point of view of a bunch of people who've gone to that state capitol and for whom being a public official is one of their life's dreams, probably because they're public spirited. probably because they believe in the idea of working for a group of people less powerful than they are. So a big part of political corruption is getting political support. And the compromises needed to get political support from vested special interests who, in the life of a state lawmaker, part-time, not enough staff, hundreds of bills going across your desk every day, every one of them a moral statement on who you are, not nearly enough time to review them. Lobbyists and special interests, first thing, just can help you out, give you some advice. That's tempting. Then they can help you with your campaign. That's tempting. Then they come to you and they have an issue that someone needs to carry. Political corruption is part of a cycle that develops from having a closed system. New York State, Albany is 150 miles from the commercial and population center of the state. What happens in Albany is not nearly as visible in our state as what happens in the New York City Council, even. That's a big driver of the corruption. The lack of both public attention and public interest. When you have citizen lobbyists coming up and pushing issues, not because they're going to make a buck, but because they care about it and have a reason that it matters in their community or in the state, that becomes a force. It's a force every bit as powerful as the vested special interests. So a big part of the political corruption cycle is about who's willing to involve themselves in politics and support politicians, and what that does to the politicians' incentives and interests over time. And then it can be corrosive over time. And so, some percentage of public officials at every level of government steal. And those who steal, it's a different kind of corruption. But the corruption that really destroys our governments is the kind of corruption I'm talking about, because it's vastly more pervasive. It's the kind of corruption that can get majority votes, that can choose what votes come up and whether they're even debated. And that corruption can be counteracted by citizen engagement that is non-transactional in this effort. That's one thing that hopefully the States Project is doing, just relieving a little pressure on transactional relationships and letting state lawmakers not focus on all of you or on me, my colleagues, but on their constituents and what they need.
So what response to your efforts are you receiving from the DNC? Do you feel supported?
So look, we all broadly have the same goal, and by we all actually would say, I would say some of that is cross-partisan. It's true of Republicans who also, believe in democracy, not autocracy, who increasingly have no home, no partisan home. I think that this is, I've touched on this a couple of times. I think that the idea that state legislatures should get the kind of focus and attention that I believe they should is not a consensus view inside the Beltway. This is the nature of parties, by the way. It's not the Democratic Party is Beltway focused and the Republican Party is heartland focused at all. Parties by their nature are Beltway focused. The most powerful elected officials, lobbyists, interest groups, media are all inside the Beltway. So there's a parties are going to focus there. One thing that happened with the New Right and with the movement that spawned groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council and Heritage Foundation and the Moral Majority and other efforts of the New Right in the 70s and 80s that led to the Reagan Revolution was actually a bunch of people who weren't part of the party, a bunch of donors and activists who really weren't part of the party, pulling that Republican Party out of its focus on the Beltway. I think it's a necessary dynamic to have folks who have less of a Washington, D.C. focus, as we do, in conversation with and in a dynamic relationship with groups like the DNC. Look, do I wish that the DNC and its biggest funders were a lot more focused on state legislatures, not state legislatures but state legislatures full stop? Absolutely. Do I understand the dynamic, and is this in general an effort that's all going in the same direction? It really is. In fact, I'd say increasingly.
So with a few minutes left, what's the good news? Do you have any? What gives you hope?
I mean, I hope that this conversation does give you some hope and some sense of inspiration, because I really have it. I have to say, through the last 4 years, I have, on my father's side of the family, they come from Ukraine. I mean, this has been a tough time in many ways for many, many folks, much less in my own personal life than what many people have suffered and what many groups have been targeted with over the last 5 years. I get up every morning excited to do this work and believing it'll make a difference. I go to bed at night, I'm not worried about these things. I understand them, but I also know that there's a strategy and a way to do something about it. The good news is this is not out of your reach, and this is not game over. We are living in a difficult time when there's a global authoritarian movement that has taken hold, even more hold in our country than it certainly did for a generation or two, where the stakes are incredibly high because of technology and all of the ways in which that accelerates both risks and also benefits and improvements. That's where we are, but we already knew that. What you might not have known coming into this call was that you literally could join up with a couple of dozen people and become the most important force, not just to flip a state, but to have a state save the democracy in 2024. That is something you can be an active participant in and actually turn the needle. The candidates we've endorsed do a couple of points better than state legislative candidates do overall. That's an enormous impact in politics. And again, it's, as I said, it's not because of some brilliant messaging genius we have sitting, with a brain hooked up to wires. It's because of the giving circles. It's because of the impact that we can have here. We are talking about this problem, identifying it, and building this movement today. This is not December 1st, 2024. I think that's good news. It's not easy news. It doesn't mean, good job, you beat Trump, congratulations. That was never going to work. But this will, and you can be a part of it. I find that very exciting, and I find the participants tonight. We have 4 Zoom pages worth of people listening to state legislatures at 8 o'clock on a beautiful March night. That's incredibly inspiring. That never would have happened in 2014. I know I tried. Would have been me and you, Wendy, and at the end we would have said, that was great. What did you think, everyone else? And no one else would have been here.
Thank you so much, Daniel. This was really informative, and I got on the call thinking I was never going to be able to sleep tonight, but you've given me some hope that maybe this...
Sleep tonight and wake up tomorrow ready to work.
Exactly. I want to thank you again for coming. And if you want to learn more about giving circles, check out the link to the States Project that's been put in the chat. I apologize for my dog. And coming up, we hope you'll join us at the upcoming Tent Talk, April 5th at noon Eastern Time, featuring Vivacino, and which is the fastest growing voting rights organization in Florida. We will also soon be kicking off our first letter writing campaign of the year very soon, so stay tuned. And again, thanks to everyone for coming, and thank you very much, Daniel. Have a good night.